Dr. Scott Leibowitz. I want to tell you a bit about him. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, author, speaker, educator, and consultant, internationally known for specializing in the care of transgender and gender diverse children and adolescents and their families. He did his pre-medical studies at Cornell and then his medical degree at Sackler School of Medicine in Tel Aviv. Between 2008 and 2024, he served in 3 academic pediatric multidisciplinary gender clinics and first entered the field of gender care for minors at Boston Children's Gender Management Service, the country's first program in an academic medical center, where he was also on faculty at Harvard Medical School. Then more recently, between 2016 and 2024, he's been an associate professor at Ohio State College of Medicine. He spent 8 years as the medical director of behavioral health for the Thrive Gender Program at Nationwide Children's Hospital. It's become the largest embedded therapy and assessment model of any pediatric American gender clinic in the country. Was the co-lead for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, that's WPATH, Standard of Care 8th edition Adolescent Guidelines chapter that was published in 2022. He served as an expert witness in several court cases, has met with politicians across the political spectrum, and has trained thousands of providers through WPATH's Global Education Institute, including Iceland, Israel, Japan, Norway, and Vietnam. He's a sought-after keynote speaker on the ethics and complexities of pediatric gender care, and he's authored over 30 academic publications and 2 clinical guides on this subject. Dr. Leibowitz.
Thank you so much. It's not my typical place to come to APA. I normally go to ACAP, so I feel welcomed by everybody here. And I'm here to talk about this very boring subject of gender and trans and gender diversity in today's day and age. I will talk about 3 basic subjects, 3 categories. The third one is one that we will come back to at the end after Brad talks. So the first 2 is what I'll speak about now. I'd like to start with something about acknowledging how controversial the subject that this is. And in all honesty, every time I go to a talk and I hear someone give a perspective, I learn from them, and I learn something new each time. People tell me that when they hear me talk, they learn from me, and people have heard me talk multiple times say that they learn something new each time. My goal in this room is to speak to everybody who has an opinion, and I'm going to guess that there's a variety of opinions. Some might even be very different from one another, perhaps even 180 degrees. And I really, truly, genuinely feel like I can share something that speaks to every single person. I hope I can. If I'm successful by doing that, then I've accomplished what I want to. This is what's driving my opinions, my clinical approach, and my thoughts on all of this stuff. So I first started was introduced in Boston. The first gender clinic in the country was at Boston Children's Hospital. There, a colleague of mine, Dr. Edwards-Leeper, Laura, she's a psychologist. She really modeled the assessment protocol after the Amsterdam and Dutch team, as they were the first in the world to really start working with these kids and considering certain treatments in minors. That model really prioritized that assessment in a very significant way. Then I moved to Chicago, and I worked for 3 years in their new gender clinic at the time. And the challenge that people experience in a place where there's very big assessment approach is that the wait list grows. And so navigating wait lists in child and adolescent psychiatry, even for all types of populations, is a challenge. And so how do you meet a patient population with very specific needs and also who has time-dependent needs sometimes? And that's always going to be a challenge. So working with clinics on figuring out how to approach access and getting enough kids in or seeing the kids to meet their needs in a timely fashion can be very difficult. And from that clinic, I appreciated that need to figure out how to see as many kids in an effective time way. And I moved to Columbus, Ohio, because the hospital there basically really took mental health as its main initiative, and that was what drew me to that hospital, because it's when it supports the services that I provide as a psychiatrist and allow us to expand in assessment and access. That's, in my opinion, a place that I want to be. So we developed a clinic at the hospital in Central Ohio that really embraced both the idea of trying to get kids in as much as possible, meet their needs as timely as possible, while also maintaining the integrity of the decision-making process and focusing in on the assessment approach. I should mention that I'm no longer there. I decided on my own to leave my position end of December, and that was in response to a legislative intrusion, what I would call it, that banned the treatments that our clinic was uniquely positioned to provide. And I felt that I can make a better difference in a different way. So let me just start by saying a discussion about the complexities and ethical debates on gender care can only seriously take place between people when both parties agree on the following. This is my opinion. That gender identity is a real and valid concept, okay, that is distinct from assigned sex, although overlapping, very complexly intertwined, but a distinct concept. Variations in alignment between the two are not inherently rooted in delusion, and often correcting that alignment with evidence-based medicine can improve people's lives. I find that if the two parties talking cannot agree on this paragraph, you're then talking past each other. You're not able to have a discussion about the how. How are we going to solve a problem? And so I would invite everybody to just see if they agree with that. If so, then great. If not, then it would be hard to have a conversation with someone who does feel that way. So the trends in this care, I will start just by saying that gender diversity is a natural variation of the human experience. In the past decade, trans and gender diverse adolescents have been increasingly presenting for care at gender clinics across the country and world. And the clinical demand and the complexity has outpaced the research advancements. And so I think Dr. Drescher invited me to this talk because this is my version of his elephant. So what I'm about to do with you is you're about to embark on a DBT journey. And so if you look at this diagram and you see the people looking at the left will see an orange circle with a dark square and say, that is what I see. And guess what? They would be true. That is what they see. The people looking at the right would look at the blue circle with the dark circular shadow, and they would say, well, that's what I see. And that would be true as well. Notice the full truth, though, lies somewhere in the middle. So people need to take a step out and consider perspectives that they don't necessarily see themselves. The challenge is when people insist that their perspective is the perspective. So a lot of the debate rests in this, a chicken and egg issue over the concept of gender dysphoria and its relationship with psychopathology. Is gender dysphoria the root cause that then leads to other psychiatric conditions, or vice versa? Do psychiatric conditions lead a person to identify as a different gender? Chicken, egg. Why is this a hard conversation to have? Because discussing mental health diagnosis challenges and gender diversity is difficult because trans people have been and continue to be invalidated and erased, with their identities being described as delusional. That's why it's really difficult to think about the idea that a particular mental health issue leads a young person to identify as trans. It's really hard to think about that. And if you think about it, an entire group of people are saying their identity is rooted in delusion. Naturally, the response is going to be no or not, if that's how they feel inherently. So when we do talk about kids who may be trying to explore their identities or understand themselves better, and perhaps a mental health challenge does lead them to explore their identity, it's hard to really have that conversation openly. But the models of thought that are out there include the minority stress, which I think a lot of people who are in this field really use this as a primary mechanism to which mental health issues are come to be in a young person through the mechanism of stigma. So a person experiences a different identity, they may express that, they may be different culturally, and then they experience stigma, and that leads to depression and anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. However, on a different side of things, there's the concept of psychological and psychiatric issues leading vulnerable, identity-fragile individuals to feel connection and comfort as trans. So in that mechanism, mental health challenges cause a person to need to connect with someone else, and then they connect with this group, and they feel this is the group for me, and therefore I am now trans. So the clinical service trends, what we've seen are that adolescent referral numbers have surpassed child referrals starting in the 2010s. It used to be children. We won't get into that too much today. I can explain why. I'm just going to go through quickly. There's also been an inversion of the sex ratio, which is something that I think anecdotally people in the clinics have seen, where what used to be assigned males at birth presenting in clinics or trans feminine young people presenting in clinics, now it's really changed. The ratio's changed to about 2/3, 1/3 if you ask consistently different clinics, and it's also been published. And there's questions why that is. There's also been an ongoing expanded concept of gender, so one where we thought of it as dichotomous, and now it's dimensional. And I think the challenge is that a lot of the rating scales that previously existed did not account for the dimensionality of gender, so it was hard to do research on that very issue. There's also been an increase in the providers serving these youth. So back in 2007, Boston Children's Hospital, just when I arrived a half a year later, was the first multidisciplinary gender clinic in the United States. And now in 2025, I would say between 50 to 100 clinics exist, although that number sadly is dwindling. And I think we can all know why. And that's why I put between 50 and 100, because I think it's unclear who's doing what. I should also mention, though, that no two gender clinics are made the same. And so there's variation in models of care delivery, which impacts the research coming out from each of those clinics. So one might be based in a mental health division that relies on outside medical providers. Another might be based in a medical or pediatric or endocrine division that relies on outside mental health providers. And then others, such as the one that I was involved in, are really based across multiple disciplines. It's water. And then the care has become intensely politicized since about 2021. Okay, so this is our first DBT moment. This is where I would say, on one side, people would say these are just vulnerable teens searching for identity. And on the other, stigma explains mental health challenges and leads these young people to engage in suicidal behavior or have a higher suicide rate. And I would invite the audience to think about this, that it's somewhere in the middle. There are going to be some kids who are vulnerable, searching for identity, and there are going to be some kids who experience stigma and have mental health challenges, and some kids who have a mixture of both. So this is complex. But yet we still find people ascribing to their idea on what needs to happen with care in absolutes. So for people who are trying to prevent an error type 1, those would be individuals who advocate to ban the treatment completely. And error types 1s are not, we should not try to complete error type 1s, because that's treating a person when they should not get treatment. And the concern for an error type 1 is that this is a young person who may have an ideological, in quotes, identity, or they're going to experience regret, reproductive sexual harm, so therefore we should not treat them. On the other hand, there are individuals who aim to prevent a type 2 error, which would be not treating a person when they should get treatment. So the concern that people advocating for type 2 errors or preventing those would say, this person, if they don't get care, they will have worsening mental health, they will delay their ability to live authentically, and they will not have an improved quality of life. In medicine, every other field, we try to prevent both. And so in my clinical opinion, which is informed by 17 years of experience working in 3 very different clinics and understanding the impact of those protocols on the outcomes, this needs to become a discussion of how to provide care, not a discussion of whether to provide care. Both error types need to be prevented. And luckily we have guides and documents and task forces and care standards that help guide our understanding of that. And I will be the first one to put up the CAS report of 2024. Dr. Cass, she's a pediatrician in the United Kingdom. She was hired to do a report, review the Tavistock Clinic based on, they had experienced some assertions about challenging treatment there. She came in and did a report, which a lot of people are holding up as sort of the main Bible to guide policy and legislation. It was published in 2024. I put independent review in quotes because I do wonder about any task force or any document that's purposely seeking out someone who's not in the field to comment, kind of slightly double standard there, because most of the times you would need to involve the people who are doing this specific work to help drive what is the aim of the report, what are some of the challenges in the field, et cetera, et cetera. 6 systematic reviews were done. And one of the main conclusions of the CAS report that I actually very strongly endorse, which a lot of people get lost in the weeds because of how the report is politicized, is that the centralized care of gender without the provision of wider mental health services and resources doesn't meet the needs of the patient population. And speaking as someone who worked in different institutions that have varying levels of mental health resources that enable us to get kids to where they need to go if they're in the wrong place, that is an ideal way of delivering this care. And so I think we need to glean from the CAS report that is something that we need to think about, the variation in mental health resources that exist in the country, and how does that impact the delivery of gender care in those locations. One of the other main conclusions was that the quality of evidence should lead the field to take a careful and cautious approach. 2 things about that. One, she did not argue to ban treatment. So the report is used often to say ban the care. She did not do that. But second, by not necessarily reaching out to people who have been in this for a really long time and gathering multiple perspectives on the matter, I can tell you my phone never rang. Dr. Cass didn't call me. By not doing that, she did not truly understand the complexities of the different outcomes that they were looking at in those systematic reviews. And I will get to that in a little bit when I summarize my thoughts on the relevance of the evidence. And what also didn't exist was any form of roadmap for access and how to actually meet the needs of this growing patient population who are coming to treatment in exponential numbers, and how do we map kids and get them to where they're at. There were other criticisms of the CAS report that I would encourage people to read. I don't want to sit and trash the CAS report in its entirety, but I do think that at the end of the day, people felt that the provider she did seek out endorsed an item that said that they did not believe trans people were kids existed. So it comes down to that fundamental question of, do you agree that these young people can exist? And that first paragraph I put up, if a third of the informants of this report ascribe to that opinion, how well represented can this report be? What are the ethical debates in the field? So I kind of break them down into 5 debates. The childhood debate is over social gender transition, not medical. Does transitioning a young person in their social identity, the use of name, pronoun, dress, etc., would that influence that person's likelihood that they would persist as the language as a trans identity through adolescence and beyond, or not? And so, should you or shouldn't you do that? That's the debate there. I'm not going to talk about that debate right now. In adolescence, I think the debates fall into 4 categories. There might be subcategories and more categories other people would add to, but puberty suppression is a debate. Medical and surgical decision-making factors is a debate. The degree of assessment and diagnostic clarity is a debate, and the timing and impact of psychiatric conditions, the impact of psychiatric conditions on the timing of delivery of care. So we have a biomedical ethical framework to help guide clinical decision-making. Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And when it comes to gender care, I would say autonomy is the desire to correct one's incongruence or for medical treatment. Beneficence is going to be feeling comfortable in one's body enough to be able to not have gender necessarily be impacting other mental health challenges. I think that's the key. Is if we're only focusing in on mental health improvement, we're leaving no room for people to actually have mental health challenges that are completely unrelated to their gender identity. And that is, I think, a key issue in assessing all of this evidence. That is a big challenge, defining the outcome. But of course, preventing harms and understanding regret and irreversible effects of treatments, that's where do no harm comes into play. And justice would be people in the world, everybody has the right to be perceived as how they identify. So again, back to our therapy. On the one hand, you have the patient experience of, I know my body, I know what I need for it. And then you have the doctor's experience of, I need to understand you before I prescribe. And both are accurate and valid. It's when one takes over too much that we don't have a system of checks and balances. That is what drives the biomedical ethical framework. So topics we should not be avoiding when we are talking about these issues include regret, detransition, peer influence, fertility, adolescent decision-making ability, the relationship with autism and other mental health challenges, sexual health, and the concept of gatekeeping. I'm just throwing the topics all up for everyone to read. Like, this is, we need to talk about this, and I embrace that. So let's move to the next section. Situating the evidence ethically and clinically. Why transition in adolescence? I thought they were all vulnerable teens. So, yes, the question, should we treat, often I think in this field has the evidence base for treatment at the center of the discussion. Does the evidence base solely dictate the question, should we treat? So, back to the CATS report. Since that report relied on 6 independent systematic reviews, I'll just focus in on the 2 of them. Puberty suppression, sex hormones. 50 total studies met criteria, 12 evaluated psychological health. 1 was rated as high quality, but it was cross-sectional. 4 studies measured gender dysphoria as the outcome, and as a result of that, there was no, they conclude that it's insufficient or inconsistent high-quality evidence to support treatment based on their evaluation of the quality of evidence. And I'll walk you through my thoughts on that in the next slide. Potentially different outcomes, though, for the different sexes, and that there was psychosocial functioning didn't change in 2 of these 12 pre-post studies. And when it came to hormones, the metric they used the metric to grade the quality of evidence. They met most of the pre-post studies after 1 year did report psychological benefit, but there were variations in representativeness as a limitation. And so I would say that the challenge with the different studies is that they're coming at a different place of protocol, and you don't know what the mental health treatment is prior to the treatment, prior to receiving that treatment. So it's very difficult to just look at all the studies together and put them in a report and say, okay, there's not enough evidence to treat, right? You have to understand on a lot more granular level the degree in which this data was obtained, and you need to be able to define what the outcomes are, which these systematic reviews weren't informed by people who could do that for them. That doesn't mean they're not important, though. They are. And so this is an overview of the direct evidence base, and I am missing studies. I do agree. I'm sure I will miss studies, but let me walk you through some of them. So these four are studies that specifically include surgical outcomes. So top surgery for transmasculine patients. Not all of them exclusively looked at top surgery or surgery as an outcome, but others did, and included, like I think the Olson-Kennedy study on the right did. But the DeVries et al. Study is the common study that everybody talks about, the most longitudinal evidence that we have. These are young people, N of less than 75, I'm forgetting offhand, but so it's not the highest N, but people that have been through puberty blockers, hormones, and then surgery, and they looked at psychological outcomes. Mind you, it was published in 2014. So these are young people, N of less than 75, I'm forgetting offhand, but so it's not the highest N, but people that have been through puberty blockers, hormones, and then surgery, and they looked at psychological outcomes. Mind you, it was published in 2014, so that the people that entered that study for a longitudinal study were somewhere in the mid-2000s, and that patient population is a different patient population than exists now. This study, the cross-sectional study that Olson-Kennedy did on chest surgery, I would argue that people should read the study in detail and look at the chest dysphoria scale that they used to understand improvement or lack thereof in those non-validated items. I'm not criticizing the study, but I'm pointing out that there are limitations in each study that we have to acknowledge, and then we also can glean from it some of the positives. It demonstrated benefit that young people did experience comfort after they went through the intervention. This Van der Miesen study in 2020 out of Amsterdam is the study that the systematic review in the CAS report said was the high quality study. And I would point that out by saying that this study had hundreds of kids who entered the treatment program in Amsterdam, compared kids who were received treatment, kids who wanted treatment but didn't get treatment, and then cisgender controls. And so that study, given the control groups, even though it was cross-sectional, is very powerful and was acknowledged as powerful, demonstrating significant positive benefit among the group that received treatment compared to both controls. This study is, I believe, from Seattle, and it's a shorter longitudinal study. The challenge with this one is that they claimed that there was improvement in mental health, but really when you read the study, there was a lack of worsening. And that's another thing to point out, is that what are we going for? Sometimes mental health that stays static is still successful. That doesn't mean that the treatment was not supposed to happen in the first place. And so I think that sometimes the way studies get framed, they can get criticized more than they actually are. But if you look at the people that didn't worsen, that's better than getting worse. And that's what that study showed. This was a study on the sexual health and functioning of trans youth who had gone through puberty blockers, and demonstrated longitudinally that these young people had emotional, romantic, and sexual improvements in their lives over a significant period of time after receiving treatment. These are retrospective studies that are using large N's. They make associations. We cannot claim causation. We can claim potential correlation, and it's important that we don't make huge assumptions or huge conclusions based on associations in retrospective survey data. These four studies, of which I'm an author on all four of them, are looking at cognitive effects of kids who received puberty blockers and or hormones, demonstrating benefit in the cognitive outcomes. This specific study, coming also from my recruitment sample in my clinic, was the first study to look at the differential benefits of social affirmation and support of parents and peers alongside a medical transition or medical treatments for those kids. So it was to say that medical treatments alone are not the intervention to think about in helping kids get better. However, they were also very important in helping the kids get better. That's the take home there. These two are more recent studies that identified a term called appearance congruence, meaning how much one's appearance is in congruence with their identified gender, led with the mechanism for which benefit was experienced. So people who got treatment that had higher degrees of appearance congruence experienced more benefit. These 4 studies came from my clinic that I used to work at, so that's just my little shout out to me. And then if you look at all of the studies, right, so we can look through each study. Most of these studies have methodological limitations, if not all, but we can glean bits and pieces from each one of them. And my sort of summary here is the evidence is evolving. It's largely levels 3, 4, and 5. Oh, and I should also, if you look at the dates of these, like a lot of these studies were published 2021, 2020, like, later. So during previous attempts to, summarize these research and translate them into clinical data, you have to think about the timing in which that happened, because if the studies happened and got published after, then those reports and processes couldn't include those studies. So the evidence is evolving. Preliminarily demonstrates psychological social benefit on certain psychometrics in certain populations in the short term, but we need to be careful about overstating the benefits. There's variation in representativeness and generalizability, and it's difficult to account for so many confounders. The degree of mental health treatment they had before, how much family support existed before, the length of time they were on treatment. There's a lot of things that need to be looked at and studied. We need to also be careful about requiring unattainable high-quality evidence to justify treatments. That level of evidence that you saw is the same levels 3, 4, and 5 of evidence that exists in many other areas of pediatric medicine and child and adolescent psychiatry, and we treat in those situations as well. The population, however, is changing, and research doesn't always measure the dimensionality of gender. So if you're not using the appropriate rating scales to understand that person's unique individualized experience, it's really hard to have statistical power or to even do certain analyses that are going to yield the results you want. And there are different outcomes that different studies are measuring. Some measure cognitive outcomes, some quality of life, some psychiatric wellness, some romantic and sexual functioning. So what is the relevance of mental health outcomes? There's no study or measure that scores the impact of gender on mental health and life satisfaction, which in and of itself, if that was to go down, yet mental health issues were still high, that could very easily mean treatment was successful. Larger ends come from population surveys, the others have low ends. So does evidence-based, that's where the root of all clinical decision-making lies? No, we have a biomedical ethical framework that we use just as we use in the rest of medicine, which the evidence informs. And let's talk about other levels of evidence, or I shouldn't say levels of evidence, other factors. I'm running out of water and I might need some, so I don't know if anybody's able to score that. Is there a biological basis of gender identity development? This kind of comes down to the very basic function of, like, do trans people exist, or is this purely ideological? And one can say that they do. And epigenetic factors actually may be at play for individuals with a biological predisposition. I know this gets touchy because if we're looking for reasons why someone is trans, people are afraid that we're going to try to prevent that from happening. So the research has to be done in good faith, and we have to just understand this, understand the population to serve it better. And I put this up just to say there are research, if we look at those individuals with sex diversity, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. There is data that demonstrates, looking at these populations, that increased hormone exposure in utero potentially could lead to higher levels of a person's identity as a gender, as a different gender than what their sex anatomy would dictate. Genetic studies show that there's higher concordance in monozygotic twins. There's brain imaging research, which is very hard to do, and there are thoughts that there are different typologies of gender identity development. And so if they conflate different groups, some of the brain structure studies might yield inconclusive evidence, but others that may be more homogeneous groups in their study might actually, I think, demonstrate that some brain structures of individuals more closely resemble their gender identity than the same than for the assigned sex, for the population of assigned sex, which is interesting. But this is hard research to do. It's not funded well. It's mostly being done in Amsterdam and Spain or in Europe. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry about that. Let's move to long-term implications of outlier pubertal timing. So if we take cisgender kids and we say that you go into puberty too early or you go into puberty too late, physical development happening too early or too late are both grounds for higher levels of mental health challenges. So combining the idea that a person may experience a gender identity that's different than what their assigned sex is, biologically perhaps, of course we can't know or test for that, nor should we, but then you take that and then you also factor in going through puberty or physical changes during an ideal window could potentially impact their life when you look at the general population of kids. And in child adolescent psychiatry, this is more theory than it is science, but I do want to say that when I learned clinically, alignment of developmental processes impacts young people's mental health outcomes. So we all know the kid that is super smart, really advanced intellectually, but emotionally they can't manage their emotions or they can't think in a mature way. Those kids are going to struggle with mental health challenges. If you have a mismatch in their physical development, their cognitive development, or social development and romantic development, the idea of getting kids aligned leads to improved mental health outcomes, suggests, again, for an individual who has a gender identity that's different than their assigned sex, going through physical development of that gender identity could potentially be a very valuable, important thing for them. So to add to the evidence base, let's add evidence on pubertal timing as it relates to kids going through puberty too early or too late, the biological basis of gender identity, and the alignment of developmental processes. Here are some puberty suppression dilemmas from my point of view. What is the intended goal for treatment? So are we trying to idealize or optimize an appearance? That could be an ethical quagmire. Who's it appropriate for? For any kid that comes in and says, "Hi, I'm exploring and I would like time to buy. I'd like to buy time," or for kids who are experiencing profound incongruence or distress that's causing them harm. How much does the minor need to understand versus the parents during the decision-making process? What role does assessment have in determining this, and who's trained to do so? How long is it appropriate to use as monotherapy? So the idea of going into puberty or delaying puberty past the age of the latest age when cisgender kids would normally be entering puberty, so around high school time, that could be harmful. That is harmful. So using puberty suppression as a monotherapy alone over a long period of time is not consistent with development for all kids. What's the short-term and long-term risk-benefit? There are risks and benefits to this treatment that need to be seriously thought about. Does the analysis change for the different sexes? Is there a point in time when the lack of sex hormone exposure is problematic? And are there partial absolute contraindications to the treatment? Oh, and what do you do when therapy and treatment and counseling isn't consistent or readily available? I mean, the whole point of it is to have therapy and exploration process in the midst of that, and what happens to the young people who say, get lost to follow up. Hormone dilemmas. What is the best outcome measure? Is mental health improvement the best outcome? Gender dysphoria reduction, patient satisfaction, quality of life, right? Each of those studies measures something different. So it's not for me to say. It's not for any one of us to say. It's for us to all put out this question to the world and do the research that brings the lived experiences of people going through that, their clinical experience scientifically to the table. And as the idea of dimensional gender has expanded with an increasingly more diverse patient population seeking care, how are we meeting the needs of this growing population with differing needs? There are differing perspectives on the source of the mental health challenges. There's variation in perspective on how to prioritize sequence of treatment. There's an imperfect mechanism to assess identity stability. So that's where our clinical experience comes into play. Psychiatric and psychological factors impacting decision-making. Like different kids have different decision-making abilities. And again, should experiencing gender incongruence alone be sufficient to treat when a young person might not have the appropriate expectations for the treatment effects? And how do we develop appropriate care delivery mechanisms that account for a diverse set of needs? So this goes back to our therapy again. There are some who argue minors are too young to make permanent decisions, and then there are others who will say, respect the teen outright, they all know who they are. And for those of us who have worked with this patient population for years, we can say the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And so clinically, we are seeing a heterogeneous group of youth seeking care. And the key questions to ask for each of these are that how mature is the adolescent when approaching important life decisions? How does the adolescent's treatment request meet their core needs? And what's the relationship between the adolescent's gender and mental health? And over time, I've experienced that gender has become more complex, not less complex. For many people, gender serves different functions, and there's nothing wrong with us saying that. We just need to understand those functions in order to understand whether a treatment meets the needs or not. And so for some, it is a core identity. For others, it may be both a core identity and a form of seeking connection, or it might be just a form of seeking connection. It might be an exploration process. It might be a way of obtaining nurturance from someone. It might be a desire to be autonomous and say, this is who I am. This is adolescence, after all. And then there's cultural expression in different mechanisms of gender that way. It could be a both and. It could be an all of the above. It could be just one. That's where the clinical work comes into play. Yet, we have those that say, the wait list is way too long. We need to get these in quick. And then you have others that say, sorry, you have to go through years and years of therapy before we can treat you. And so the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So let's add to our decision-making model, clinical protocol and delivery of care, and getting kids access to timely treatment should be impacting that overall question. Now let's talk about the harms. Here's my water. I definitely need water for this. Okay, so there's a big focus out there on detransition and regret. I'd like to point out these 3 studies because they're important. I wish I had time to talk about everything so much. It's very hard right now to do that. But what's interesting is this study out of Germany found that looking at 237 detransitioners, interestingly, 92% were designated females at birth, 65% had medically transitioned, so not all of them had. 60% experienced regret, but the time that those people made decisions about treatment was actually beyond 18, not younger. So at a point in time when they were actually able to make their own decisions without their parents' input. The Littman study talks about 100 individuals who all detransitioned, all of whom had gone through medical treatments. 55% felt they did not receive adequate medical or mental health assessment. And 38% felt past experience of trauma or poor mental health led to gender dysphoria. So again, remember when I said in the beginning, how if we invalidate an entire group of people and say their identity is based in delusion, how bringing that up can be really difficult. It's really difficult. But at the same time, I think embracing the complexity and understanding that humans are diverse in the way they come to us. That's important. And then this last study, a researcher in Toronto, Ken McKinnon, he published qualitative data that had the similar theme of, I did not explore this enough. I wish I had taken more time to make that decision. It's really hard to study regret in detransition because regret it's not just a yes, no. There's outcome regret and there's decisional regret. And those are two different things. You can regret an outcome and not regret a decision. So when we talk about regret, they're all going to regret it. What does that even mean? And then there's shame associated with regretting the decision. So a lot of people don't feel comfortable even sharing the basis of their regret because there's such huge pressures not to regret. And when it comes to detransition, it's hard to come forward and say, this is my experience when an entire group of people's care is being revoked as a result of that experience being weaponized. And what's really interesting is that we only hear a subset of detransitioners, the ones that are particularly loud and want their experience known to impact policy. And that's great. So this comes down to they're all going to regret it in detransition on one hand, or regret is rare, detransition only happens due to stigma on the other. It's way more complicated than any of us in this room, myself included, understand. But can we prevent regret ever in medicine? Well, what about the whole assessment question? The largest body of evidence for the long-term benefits of gender-affirming medical treatments in youth was done in a clinic that had a very prolonged comprehensive assessment model, Amsterdam's clinic, the VUNC. But there are a wide array of protocols that exist in different clinics with different staff resources and who completes it. So again, like I said, no two gender clinics are alike, and the evidence that demonstrates the benefit, remember all those fancy squares I put up and how many of them were focusing on the Dutch clinic? They come from a cohort that went through this protocol, and that is important to note. So again, this falls under the category of they need to be fully stable before they can move forward with treatment on one hand, or all the mental health issues will go away with treatment on the other. And I think, again, we can all agree the complexity of the human experience, where in psychiatry, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I want everyone to say somewhere in the middle by the end of this. So should we treat? Well, if we factor in the evidence on harms and the cultural belief systems, there's multiple factors that go into that decision, which is rooted in the biomedical ethical framework. Evidence-based being one of those factors. And so this is the standard of care that was published in 2022. So after a lot of those studies were published. And these are guardrails. I'll just quickly go through them. One must have qualifications in identity development to be assessing the young person. One should approach gender openly as though there's no preferred gender for a person who's with a particular body, openly. The third says, do a comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment, which is meant to determine a differential diagnosis, a psychological understanding of that young person in totality, and identify treatment and sequence mechanism. It does not dictate you must do medical treatment. 4 says promote acceptance of gender diversity in the systems where young people live. 5 says a priori attempts to change a young person's identity with a preferred idea is wrong. 6 and 7 are physical treatment interventions that may be useful during a process of decision-making discernment. So using menstrual suppression to address a person's dysphoria when they're experiencing their menstrual cycle, binding, tucking. These are helpful ways that some adolescents may engage in the treatment process better. 8 says maintain a relationship throughout treatment. 9 says multidisciplinary perspectives are crucial, and I would agree as someone that worked in 3 different clinics. Inform people about reproductive fertility options. Involve the caregivers and the parents in the process unless they're deemed harmful, like if a parent's incarcerated or traumatized or has been a previous traumatizer of the young person. And then 612 specifies meet the diagnostic criteria when in a particular country. This must be a sustained identity experience over time. One must have maturity sufficient to provide informed consent. The mental health concerns are addressed and prioritized. Reproductive fertility options are discussed, and specifically puberty suppression must be provided only if the person meets 10 or 2, not before. So these serves as guardrails and serves as a mechanism of ensuring that we are doing due diligence and understanding the complexity of each person. Unfortunately, this has gotten to the final penultimate part of our therapy, which is those who say ban the care and those who say eliminate guardrails. The challenge is that neither side sees the middle often. And the people on this side will say, this is the sole truth. The people on that side will say, that's the sole truth. So we, again, preventing only one of the two error types instead of trying to prevent both. And this should really be a discussion about how to do the care, not whether to do the care. And so since we can't predict the future, nor can we do so in any other area of medicine, aka predicting future regret, what we can do is protect the integrity of the decision-making process by discussing all of these issues and ensuring an appropriate developmental understanding of the key concepts involved in the treatments and what those treatments may lead to. And so that is my time to end. I will come back. Sorry if I spoke a little bit too long, but thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm back before we hear from Jack. I do want to just point out that to be in front of an audience and speak on these issues in this day and age is one that makes us vulnerable. It's one that makes me vulnerable. And in order for us to have these important nuanced conversations about complex issues and talk about it in a scientifically curious way, we need to be able to protect the integrity of this meeting. And in this room, someone has recorded everything that has been said. I received a text from a journalist about the contents of this talk. That makes it really hard to have a conversation in here, and that's shutting down really difficult conversations. One snippet of what I said could potentially be aired on some media, either extreme right or extreme left, whatever it is. And the whole point of my talk was, let's embrace the complexity and nuance. And, I'm putting myself up here transparently for this audience. The people who are recording me speaking right now, I wish they could be transparent about that themselves. And I would ask to not record.
They should also know that it's against the rules of APA conventions to do that, and you can lose your badge and be thrown out.
And I would ask you to not record this section. So political intrusion. Just to give you a sense of what my last 3 years have been like clinically. In 2021, November, the first gender care ban was introduced in Ohio. And then 26 months of time we endured in clinic navigating families who were facing the potential threat of a bill passing. 9 proponent hearings, 6 opponent hearings, it's 15 hearings. You can imagine the days after each hearing, what that does to our epic inboxes, to the calls. What's going to happen? The increase in suicidality, the amount of time talked in each appointment about that alone, as opposed to care that could be done. It's already complex enough, and now we're monopolizing each time. It wasn't until 2 legislative sessions it took 26 months later to pass both chambers with a grandparent clause. It's kind of those kids who were already on treatment could remain on treatment once the law was in effect. Fortunately, we had time with a governor, and again, this is something that I would not say if I know I'm being recorded, right? But because I don't think that I'm trying to educate psychiatrists on the importance and the impact of this political mess and its impact and intrusion on a group of people who really are scapegoats, and that should just not happen. But I was fortunate enough to meet with the governor and he sought me out. I didn't seek anybody out. He sought us out. And I was able to really introduce him to families, explain to him the process by which we do things, how careful and how long it takes, and all the mischaracterizations that were happening, that were being lodged at us, and parents who can't defend themselves because they have to put their privacy and safety of their kid on the line in order to speak out and have their experience shared. I'm the person that can take that, but they can't. And so it's not fair. And another thing, the best defense of a physician is the electronic health record, which is protected by HIPAA. And so one does not have access to that. So there's a lot of chattering all back and forth, but the privacy of the medical record and the privacy of patients and safety of families is what makes this conversation difficult, and it's what makes them people that cannot defend themselves against these injustices. Unfortunately, the legislature overrode their own governor's veto. And then for 7 months before the law went into effect, our team dealt with having to navigate families making decisions under this duress of knowing that at a moment in time in the future, their choice was being removed. The impact that that has on clinical decision making, that is a whole other circle in my circle diagram, and so complex to navigate these conversations. Think about the families where we felt the kid should not move forward with treatment, and then the parents were viewing us as worse than the government as a result of, because we're the ones now that are saying by X day, if this kid doesn't start treatment, you're not going to be on treatment for years. Typically, we rely on a not now for whatever reason, not never. And I think that the impact that this has on the psyche of people making decisions itself will be one for the books in the future. And then since August 2024, when the bill went into effect and the bans prevented people from getting blockers or hormones, our research recruitment dropped. We had three main research protocols. We had outcomes data that we were trying to collect, longitudinal data, all the data that people say are missing, we were trying to collect so that we could put out to the world, here's how you can deliver this care in an ethical way and do it right and still get the types of outcomes that we all are hoping to get. So practicing under threat is a challenging time to practice. Planning for the implementation of the law, it's really 7 months, and managing the emotional impact on families, managing our own emotions, protecting the integrity of the decision-making process beyond what we normally had to do, and working with our institution to implement and operationalize something that really doesn't even make any sense. And then practicing with the law in effect is managing the emotional impact of parents, patients, family members, teams, continuing to serve the patients already on care, but then supporting families who cannot access medically indicated treatments. So how do we implement under our care ban? Well, ensure that we're complying with legal restrictions. Nobody wants to be hauled off to El Salvador. Managing dysphoria without medical or surgical interventions, legal name changes, menstrual suppression, helping address their physical needs, gender support therapy in ways that does not predetermine or presuppose a preferred gender outcome. That is different. Okay. And then ensuring gender literacy, so ensuring that people understand important concepts, the irreversibility of treatments, evolution of different identities, and understanding sexism and stereotypes. These are all things that we can still do in therapy, which are important things to do. And then just maintaining a sense of protection, working with the families to provide support and acceptance. So I'll let Jack reflect. I really don't think that this was not designed to cut into the Q&A, because I would stay here for another 2 hours and engage in the Q&A, but it's just a hard topic to do concisely, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
We're well over time, and unfortunately we don't have time for looking at the questions that people submit.